Hey all you cats and chicks out there, welcome back to Control Players Unite. I'm your host, Dr. Red. Today we will be reviewing all of the hand and deck manipulation cards in the current standard format, which includes cards that also give knowledge of your opponent's hand and deck. These cards allow you to know which cards your opponent has in hand for immediate use, or could use if digging. They also allow you to alter your opponent's hand and deck to your liking. Some cards will be given some elaboration, others will be glossed over, and the list is in the description. Let's begin. The first is Amoonguss with the Surprise Spores ability. During your opponent's turn, if this Pokemon is discarded from your hand by an effect of an attack, or ability from your opponent's Pokemon, or by an effect of your opponent's item or supporter cards, discard your opponent's entire hand. I'm surprised this hasn't come up more with Block Snorlax or Pidgeot EX Control decks for those wanting to tech for something like Hand Trimmer, but it remains to be seen. Masquerain, this card is not used at all. Panic Prompting Pattern, flip a coin until you get tails. For each heads, discard a random card from your opponent's hand. Scoville EX, this card has seen a lot of success in Japan City League decks and tournaments. It has the two-headed crushing ability, discard a random card from your opponent's hand and also discard the top card of your opponent's deck. I think this card has the potential to break out, but 140 damage might not be enough, but we'll see what happens as the meta evolves. Kingdra Seething Currents, once during your turn you may have either player shuffle their hand and put it on the bottom of their deck. If that player put any cards at the bottom of their deck in this way, they draw 4 cards. This card hasn't seen any play. Luvdisc, each player reveals the top 2 cards of their deck, then draws those cards. Sharpedo, I've seen this in one Japanese deck. Flip 3 coins for each heads, discard a random card from your opponent's hand. Wimpod, flip a coin, if heads, discard a random card from your opponent's hand. Luxray V, this card is immensely popular in Pidgeot EX Control decks. It has the attack Fang Snipe for 30 damage. Your opponent reveals their hand, discard any trainer card you find there. I have seen players playing online tournaments win an entire match single-handedly from this card. It is extremely powerful. Toxtricity, yank away, choose 2 random cards from your opponent's hand. Your opponent reveals those cards and shuffles them into their deck. Wattrel, devastating win, your opponent shuffles their hand into their deck and draws 4 cards. Bayonet EX, this card is the bane of any number of players' existences. Everlasting Darkness does 30 damage. During your opponent's next turn, they can't play any item cards from their hand. But also Poltergeist, your opponent reveals their hand. This attack does 60 damage for each trainer card you find there. It functions more because of Everlasting Darkness being a card lock attack, but Poltergeist is the reason why this card is in this deck, and Bayonet EX is extremely powerful. I'm surprised it hasn't seen more play, though it has been paired with a number of things like Giratina V-Star and a Spathor EX. Gengar, Poltergeist, your opponent reveals their hand. This attack does 50 damage for each trainer card you find there. Gothitelle. This card has seen success also in Japan City League decks, hasn't seen any success here in the West. Has the ability to read the stars. Once during your turn, you may look at the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck, put one of them back, put the other card on the bottom of their deck. Gourgeist, Starling Pumpkin ability. If this Pokemon is knocked out by damage from an attack from your opponent's Pokemon, discard 2 random cards from your opponent's hand. Greavard, your opponent reveals their hand, choose a supporter card and put it on the bottom of their deck. Hisuian Typhlosion V never saw any play and probably won't. Petrifying Flame, choose a random card from your opponent's hand. Your opponent reveals that card and shuffles it into their deck. Iron Valiant, this is for yourself. Calculation, look at the top 4 cards of your deck, put them back in any order. Malamar, each player reveals their hand. If a card in your opponent's hand has the same name as a card in your hand, this attack does 90 more damage. The other Malamar has the ability Psychic Insight. Once during your turn, you can look at the top card of your opponent's deck, and if you do, look at the top card of your deck. This helps you to see what your opponent's going to draw on his or her next turn. Mawile V, chomp down, discard a random card from your opponent's hand. Mismagius Ominous Pros, your opponent reveals their hand. If they have 4 or more cards in their hand, you choose all but 3, and your opponent shuffles the chosen cards into their deck. Mr. Mime Lookalike Show, your opponent reveals their hand. You may use the effect of a supporter card you find there as the effect of this attack. There is an Oranguru card with a similar attack wherein the supporter is in the discard pile. Togepi Whiny Voice, choose a random card from your opponent's hand. Your opponent reveals that card and shuffles it into their deck. Absol EX Future Sight, look at the top 3 cards of either player's deck and put them back in any order. This might be good with something like Arbok EX, if only as a tech, but Arbok EX has a hard time getting off the ground, so we'll see what happens. It has the attack Menacing Fangs. Your opponent discards 2 cards from their hands. It also does 150 damage. Honchkrow EX, Fearsome Shadow. Your opponent reveals their hand, although it's used more for its ability Boss Pockets, where you can hold up the 4 tools, and it's used usually in conjunction with, oh gosh, what's that card called? Pakarisu, with its ability. It has an attack that allows you to do damage according to how many tools your opponent have attached to it. 2 in total. Krookodile, when you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon during your turn, you may discard a random card from your opponent's hand. If this Pokemon is your active Pokemon and is knocked out, you may discard a random card from your opponent's hand. Weavile, flip 2 coins. If either of them is heads, your opponent reveals their hand. For each heads, you choose a card you find there, put on the bottom of your opponent's deck in any order. Zubat, this was suggested by Sander Wojciech, a control player from the Netherlands, to be in a control deck. You attach a rescue board to it, and for the revealing echo ability, once during your turn, if this Pokemon is in the active spot, you have your opponent reveal their hand. Aipom, or is it Aipom? Mischievous Tail, look at the top card of your opponent's deck. You may have your opponent shuffle their deck. Ambipom, knock off, discard a random card from your opponent's hand. Eevee, Whiny Voice, choose a random card from your opponent's hand. Your opponent reveals and shuffles it into their deck. Farigiraf, either face, choose a player. That player shuffles their hand into their deck and draws 4. Hoothoot, your opponent reveals their hand. Noctowl, your opponent reveals their hand. Now we're into the trainers with Grabber. Your opponent reveals their hand. You put a Pokemon you find there on the bottom of your deck, on the bottom of their deck. I warn you, players, you have to put the Pokemon at the bottom. You cannot just get a free look at the opponent's hand. You have to put a Pokemon there. Hand Trimmer, each player discards cards from their hand until they have 5 cards, and your opponent discards first. This is the card I was referencing when I mentioned Amoonguss. Choi, each player reveals their hand and draws 3. Clive, your opponent reveals their hand and you draw 2 cards for each supporter you find there. Airy, this card is absolutely overpowered. It has won me a number of matches. It's winning a lot of players' online matches. Your opponent reveals their hand and you can discard up to 2 item cards you find there. This card is absolutely insane. If anytime you can include a tech into your deck after you made it consistent, definitely consider Airy. It is not a waste of your space. Iono, this is a quintessential card in virtually every deck. Each player shuffles the hand into their deck, puts on the bottom. If either player put any cards on the bottom of their deck in this way, each player draws a card for each of their remaining prize cards. So if you have 6 prize cards remaining, you get 6 cards. You have 4 prize cards remaining, you get 4 cards. Judge. Each player shuffles a hand to their deck and draws 4. Those attacks we saw earlier, and also the abilities that allow a player to shuffle his or her hand into the deck and draw 4, it's based around this card, Judge. Judge has been around for a while. It's an extremely powerful disruption card. Like Airy, definitely worth the space if you can fit it in. Ortega, this card sees no play whatsoever. Your opponent reveals their hand, you choose a card you find there, put them on the bottom. But if you put a card on the bottom, your opponent can draw a card. Roxanne, this card is extremely disruptive. We see it played in a lot of Lost Zone decks. You can use this card only if your opponent has 3 or fewer prize cards remaining. Each player shuffles their hand into their deck, and then you draw 6 and your opponent draws 2. This is also really good for Arbok EX that can discard 2 cards with its Menacing Fangs attack, or any attack that can discard or shuffle cards back into a deck. Roxanne is a very, very good card to pair something like that with. Curse Duster. I think this is the last one. If the Pokemon this card is attached to is knocked out by damage from an attack from your opponent's Pokemon, discard a random card from your opponent's hand. Now we're back to the beginning. I hope this gave you some ideas, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for watching. Please take care of yourselves, and God bless you.